When a journalist mocked Donald Trump on a live show, no one expected his calm response to steal the show. The lights of the studio blazed down on the sleek glass table at the center of the set, reflecting the intense energy of the moment. Rows of live audience members sat in anticipation, their murmurs blending with the hum of cameras and crew moving just out of frame. This wasn't just any primetime talk show. It was one of the most watched live broadcasts in the country. Millions were tuned in, and everyone in the room could feel the tension thickening like a storm about to break. Seated across from each other, divided by that very table, were two figures that couldn't be more different yet equally commanding. On one side was the TV host, renowned for their razor-sharp tongue and relentless approach to questioning. They were the type who thrived on controversy, celebrated for leaving their guests squirming under the pressure of their pointed questions. With a polished smile and a poised demeanor, the host exuded confidence, their pen tapping lightly on the edge of their notebook as they prepared to strike. On the other side sat Donald Trump, as unshaken and unapologetic as ever. His signature red tie was perfectly in place, his body language relaxed but charged with the kind of energy that kept audiences glued to their screens. Love him or hate him, one thing was certain. Trump never failed to deliver a show. The audience knew that any attempt to corner him could backfire spectacularly. It was this unpredictability, this ability to take control of the room in an instant, that made him both a formidable guest and an irresistible draw for ratings. The show's introduction rolled, the dramatic music cue fading as the host began speaking into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a guest who needs no introduction. Business mogul, former president, and a man who always speaks his mind, Donald J. Trump. The audience clapped, though the applause was a mix of enthusiasm and reserved politeness. "Mr. Trump," the host began, turning to him with a smile that could almost pass as genuine, "thank you for joining us tonight. I think we can all agree it's going to be an interesting conversation." Trump's lips curled into a half-smile as he leaned into the microphone. "Interesting? That's one way to put it. Let's see if you can keep up." A ripple of laughter moved through the studio, breaking the ice but also setting the tone for what was about to unfold. The host chuckled, though their grip on the pen tightened almost imperceptibly. This wasn't going to be an ordinary interview. Both the audience and the host could sense it. The stage was set for a clash, and no one could predict how the evening would end. The host leaned forward slightly, their polished smile still intact as they began the conversation with the ease of a seasoned performer. "Mr. Trump," they started, their tone light and conversational. "It's been quite a journey for you. Business mogul, former president, media personality, you've worn many hats. Tell me, do you ever get tired of being in the spotlight?" Trump chuckled, a deep, deliberate sound that seemed to echo across the studio. "Tired? Not a chance. You see, when you're winning, the spotlight is just part of the deal," he said, leaning back in his chair with practiced confidence. "And let's be honest, the media keeps me in it more than I ever could myself." The audience chuckled, some clapping lightly. The host smiled tightly, their pen tapping against their notebook as they prepared to steer the conversation into more pointed territory. "Fair enough," they replied, "but you've faced your fair share of critics, haven't you? Some say your approach is unconventional, to say the least." Trump didn't miss a beat. "Unconventional gets results," he replied smoothly, his voice carrying that unmistakable edge of certainty. "And let's face it, if everyone agreed with me, you wouldn't have a show tonight, would you?" The crowd erupted into laughter, the sound rolling through the studio. Even the host couldn't suppress a small laugh, though their grip on the pen tightened slightly. "Touché," they said, nodding as they flipped a page in their notebook. "But let's talk about some of those results. Your critics have plenty to say about your policies during your presidency, some even calling them divisive. How do you respond to that?" Trump tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question for a moment longer than necessary. "Divisive is just a fancy word for effective," he said finally, his tone calm but laced with unmistakable confidence. When you make decisions that matter, not everyone's going to be happy, but if you try to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one. And I think we've had enough of that in this country, don't you? The applause from parts of the audience seemed to take the host by surprise. They glanced toward the cameras, their smile faltering for a fraction of a second before they regained their composure. "Well, you've certainly been consistent in your beliefs," they replied, their voice smooth but edged with a subtle challenge. "But some might argue that consistency isn't always a virtue, especially when it comes to relationships." The audience stilled, sensing the shift in tone. The host's words hung in the air like bait, and everyone, including Trump, knew what was coming. The host's pen hovered over their notebook as they leaned in slightly, their polished smile turning sharp. "Speaking of relationships," they continued, their voice dropping just enough to create a sense of intimacy. "You've been married to Melania for quite some time now, but I have to ask, has your marriage to Melania ever felt like a mistake?" A gasp rippled through the audience, followed by an uneasy silence. The cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, searching for any crack in his composure. But instead of faltering, Trump leaned forward slightly, his expression calm yet unreadable. He placed his hands lightly on the table, his fingers steepled in a gesture of quiet control. The host, emboldened by the silence, pressed on. "I mean, given the pressures of your public life, the scandals, the constant media scrutiny, it must have been challenging to say the least. Surely there were moments when you thought, this isn't worth it." The tension in the room was almost tangible, the audience holding their breath as they waited for Trump's response. The host's eyes gleamed with confidence, as if they believed they had finally found the chink in his armor. But Trump's silence wasn't a sign of hesitation. It was a calculated pause, the kind that only someone with years of experience in high-stakes situations could pull off. And then, just as the silence threatened to stretch too long, Trump smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that sent a ripple of anticipation through the room. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice low and measured. "Absolutely not. The only mistake here is thinking you could get away with that question on live TV." The audience erupted into laughter, the tension breaking like a dam. Even those who had been on the host's side couldn't help but chuckle at the sheer audacity of Trump's response. But he wasn't finished. Trump leaned back in his chair, his hands spreading in a gesture of mock incredulity. "In fact, Melania told me just this morning to be ready for questions like this," he continued, his voice carrying a playful lilt. "She said, 'Donald, remember you're married to me, not to the ratings.' And I think she's got a point, because clearly you're desperate for both." The laughter swelled, drowning out any attempt by the host to regain control. For a moment, the room was completely Trump's, his presence dominating not just the conversation but the very atmosphere. The host opened their mouth as if to respond, but no words came. They glanced down at their notebook, flipping a page with a nervous chuckle, clearly searching for a way to shift the focus. Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a tone that was both teasing and commanding. "Let's move on, shall we?" he said, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I wouldn't want you to lose any more control of your own show." The audience roared with laughter and applause, the sound echoing through the studio. The host's face flushed slightly as they shuffled their notes, their confidence visibly shaken. And as the cameras zoomed out for a commercial break, one thing was clear. The dynamics of the evening had shifted completely, and Trump was firmly in control. As the laughter from Trump's last remark began to fade, the host forced a tight smile, flipping through their notes with a deliberate air of composure. But anyone paying close attention could see the slight tremor in their hand, the telltale sign of someone scrambling to regain their footing. The audience, however, was already leaning in Trump's favor, their energy palpable as they anticipated what would come next. "Well, Mr. Trump," the host began, their voice just a touch sharper than before, "it's clear you have a talent for commanding a room. But let's talk about something more serious. Your legacy. Many critics argue that your presidency left the country more divided than ever. How do you respond to that? Trump didn't miss a beat. My legacy, he said, his tone laced with amusement. Let me tell you something about legacy. It's written by the people who win, not the people who whine. The crowd erupted into laughter and applause, a few even standing to cheer. Trump allowed himself a small, triumphant smile as he waited for the noise to die down. The host, however, was undeterred. They leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as they pressed on. But surely you can't deny that your policies sparked significant controversy, the host countered, their voice rising slightly. Many would say that your approach alienated millions of Americans. Do you regret anything about how you handled your presidency? Trump shrugged, his expression casual. Look, controversy is just a fancy word for doing something different, he replied, his voice steady. If I had done what everyone else wanted, we'd still be stuck in the same mess we were in before. Sometimes you have to make waves to make progress. The audience clapped again, though the applause was less boisterous this time, as some viewers mulled over his words. The host seized the opportunity, their confidence returning as they prepared their next move. Well, let's talk about one of those waves, they said, their tone shifting to one of barely disguised accusation. Your stance on immigration, for instance. Critics have called it cruel, inhumane, even un-American. How do you justify policies that separated families and built walls instead of bridges? The question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. The audience shifted in their seats, their reactions divided. Trump, however, remained unruffled. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the host as he spoke. You know, it's funny, he began, his voice calm but cutting. The people who talk the loudest about walls are usually the ones hiding behind the biggest gates. My policies weren't about division, they were about protection. There's a difference. The host opened their mouth to respond, but Trump raised a hand, silencing them with a gesture. And before you ask, he continued, his tone growing sharper, yes, I made tough decisions. Yes, I took action that some people didn't like. But do you know what's worse than making tough decisions? Doing nothing at all. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience like a blanket. Even the host seemed momentarily taken aback, their prepared rebuttal forgotten in the face of Trump's unyielding conviction. But they weren't ready to give up yet. After a brief pause, the host leaned back in their chair, their expression carefully neutral as they changed tactics. All right, Mr. Trump, they said, their voice steady but edged with a hint of sarcasm. You've made your point, but let's pivot to something a little more personal. Trump raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable as the host flipped to a new page in their notebook. You've been in the public eye for decades, they continued, their tone almost casual. And with that kind of exposure comes scrutiny, sometimes even scandal. How do you handle the constant criticism, the attacks on your character, your family? Trump's lips curved into a wry smile. Criticism? That's just free publicity, he quipped, earning another wave of laughter from the audience. And as for attacks on my character, well, let's just say the people doing the attacking don't exactly have a spotless record themselves. The host chuckled, though the sound was hollow. Fair enough, they said, their smile tight. But surely there are moments when it gets to you, moments when you wonder if it's all worth it. Trump's expression softened slightly, his gaze distant for a brief moment before he spoke. Look, I'm not going to pretend it's easy, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. There are days when the noise gets loud, when the pressure feels endless. But at the end of the day, I know why I do what I do, and that's what keeps me going. The audience clapped politely, some nodding in agreement. The host, sensing an opening, leaned forward once more, their pen poised above their notebook. And does that include your marriage to Melania? They asked, their voice smooth but laced with implication. Has your marriage ever felt like a mistake? The audience gasped, the tension in the room spiking as all eyes turned to Trump. For a moment, the studio was so silent that even the faint hum of the cameras seemed deafening. The host's question hung in the air, bold and provocative, designed to provoke a reaction. Trump, however, didn't flinch. He met the host's gaze head-on, his expression calm but sharp. "A mistake?" he repeated, his voice low and deliberate. "Absolutely not. The only mistake here is thinking you could get away with that question on live TV." The audience exploded into laughter, the tension breaking like a dam as Trump leaned back in his chair, his confidence unshaken. The host, caught off guard by the force of his response, fumbled for a moment before attempting to recover. "In fact," Trump continued, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade, "Melania told me just this morning to be ready for questions like this. She said, 'Donald, remember, you're married to me, not to the ratings.' And I think she's got a point, because clearly you're desperate for both." The crowd roared with laughter and applause, the sound echoing through the studio. The host, visibly flustered, shuffled their notes, their confidence visibly shaken as they struggled to regain control of the conversation. But it was clear to everyone in the room that the power dynamic had shifted, and Trump was firmly in command. The laughter that filled the studio had an edge to it, part amusement, part disbelief. Trump's retort had landed with precision, cutting through the host's carefully constructed facade. For a moment, the host sat frozen, their polished demeanor faltering as they processed what had just happened. The audience, meanwhile, was fully engaged, their cheers and applause drowning out any hope of a quick recovery. Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression one of calm satisfaction as he surveyed the room. It was clear that he had won this round, and everyone knew it. But the host wasn't ready to concede just yet. With a deep breath and a tight smile, they flipped to a new page in their notebook, their eyes scanning for a lifeline. "Well, Mr. Trump," they began, their voice steady but lacking its earlier confidence, "you certainly know how to keep an audience entertained. But let's not forget why we're here tonight. This isn't just about entertainment, it's about accountability, and I think the viewers at home deserve to hear some real answers." Trump's smile didn't waver. "Accountability?" he repeated, his tone light but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I'm all for accountability. In fact, I've been more accountable to the American people than most politicians in the last 50 years. But let's be honest here. You're not really interested in accountability, are you? You're interested in a headline." The audience erupted into laughter and applause once again, the sound filling the studio as the host's smile grew even tighter. "I think we can do both," they replied, their tone clipped. "Now, if I may, I'd like to ask you about your plans for the future. Are you considering another run for office?" Trump tilted his head slightly as if weighing his response. "Well, that depends," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a calculated pause. "Do you think the country is ready for me to fix things again? Because, let's face it, someone has to." The crowd's reaction was instant and electric, a mix of cheers, laughter, and scattered boos that only seemed to amplify the energy in the room. Trump allowed himself a small smile, clearly relishing the moment. The host, however, seized on the opportunity to regain control. "And if you do run again," they pressed, their voice rising slightly, "how do you plan to address the criticisms that have followed you since your last term? The divisiveness, the controversies? Do you think the American people will trust you again?" Trump leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table as he met the host's gaze head-on. "Trust is earned," he said, his tone measured, "and I've earned it by delivering results. The real question is, can the American people trust the media to tell the truth about those results? Because, let's be honest, you're not exactly known for giving me a fair shake." The audience erupted into applause once more, the sound drowning out the host's attempt to respond. Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but triumphant. The host, visibly flustered, shuffled their notes again, their earlier confidence now fully replaced by a growing sense of frustration. But it was clear that Trump wasn't finished. "You know," he continued, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade, I've been in this game long enough to know how it works. You can ask all the tough questions you want, but at the end of the day, it's not about what I say, it's about what the people see. And tonight, they're seeing a lot more than you bargained for." The crowd erupted once again, their cheers and applause echoing through the studio as the host struggled to regain their composure. For a moment, the two sat in silence, the tension in the room palpable as the cameras zoomed in on their faces. Finally, the host leaned forward, their expression tight as they spoke. "Well, Mr. Trump," they said, their voice low but steady, "you certainly have a way with words. But I think it's time we let the viewers decide who really came out on top tonight." Trump's smile widened, his gaze unwavering as he replied, "I think they already have." The studio erupted into applause one last time, the sound filling the room as the cameras panned across the audience. Some were clapping enthusiastically, others sat in stunned silence, and a few were already reaching for their phones to capture the moment. As the show cut to commercial, the host leaned back in their chair, their expression a mix of frustration and defeat. Trump, meanwhile, remained composed, his confidence unshaken as he exchanged a few words with the crew. The fallout from the live broadcast was immediate. Social media exploded with clips of the exchange, hashtags like #TrumpDestroysHost and #LiveShowdown trending within minutes. Some users praised Trump for his wit and composure, while others criticized the host for their aggressive tactics. "Say what you want about Trump," one viral tweet read, "but the man knows how to handle himself under pressure." That was a masterclass in staying cool and commanding the room. Others were less charitable, accusing the host of going too far with their questions. "The host lost control the moment they made it personal," another tweet argued. "You can't win against Trump by playing dirty. He'll always outmaneuver you." News outlets picked up the story within hours, with headlines ranging from Trump's live TV triumph to host's embarrassing defeat on primetime. Talk shows, podcasts, and online forums buzzed with debates over the night's events, with some calling it a turning point in media and politics. But for Trump, the aftermath was just another day. He returned to his routine with the same unshakable confidence that had defined his performance on the show. When asked about the broadcast during a press conference the following day, he simply shrugged and said, "It was fun, wasn't it?" As for the host, the fallout was more complicated. Their sharp critiques of Trump had earned them both praise and backlash in the past, but this time the narrative had shifted. They found themselves the subject of criticism, accused of losing control of the conversation and underestimating their guest. The broadcast had been more than just an interview. It had been a spectacle, a collision of personalities that left viewers questioning not only the dynamics of power and media, but also their own biases. Trump's ability to turn the tables, to command the room with humor and wit, served as a reminder of the unpredictability of live television and the power of staying composed under pressure. For better or worse, the night had left its mark, sparking conversations that would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling. And as the dust settled, one thing was clear. When it came to commanding the spotlight, Donald Trump was still in a league of his own. If you're as moved as we are by this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel.